we could talk about this anthropocentricity critique. So this critique that, well, morality is just a human construct, and basically all the words that we are using and everything that we are speaking or thinking about is just human constructs, and there is no objective measure of things in reality. Like you said, this quote by Pythagoras, that man is the measure of all things, that someone could object, well, yeah, but then it just means that basically we are kind of doing everything in our own head, but it's not really having anything to do with reality or truth in an absolute sense. So what would you think of this problem?
So yeah, this is an epistemological issue. For those in the audience who don't know epistemology, that is the part of philosophy dealing with knowledge. How do we know things? How can we understand reality, etc.? And I would say that morality and terms like moral, right, wrong, they signify a truth about the real world. So it's not that we invent morality and the truth of morality and moral values. It's rather that we recognize them to be what they are. So I would thus say that we human beings, we have reason, we have intelligence, we can recognize how the world works. And based off of what we see and observe around us, and based off our ability to understand it, we can use our reason to compare things in different ways and also compare things morally. And as I've argued before, we can see morality by deliberation about human nature and teleology. So perhaps I could briefly define what teleology means. Teleology is the idea that there exist ends or goals or purposes for things, that things in reality have certain purposes or functions. They are meant to be a certain way as its final condition, you might say. And this purpose is something that is grounded in the nature of that thing in question. It is something that involves the function of the thing, what the thing in itself tries to accomplish. So it's not meant to be a conscious purpose. Some people have seemed to strawman Aristotle, to seem to think that things necessarily have a consciousness and can consciously desire a certain goal and strive toward it. But that's not really what teleology is about. You don't need to have a conscious purpose in order to establish it. It's just the end to which the thing is striving toward. So an example, or some examples, would be, say, the heart in the body. The heart has as purpose to pump blood. That is its function. According to its nature, that it strives toward. It operates in a way that is led toward the pumping of blood as its end goal. And therefore, we would say that the teleological end of hearts is to pump blood. The nose has as its purpose to smell things, not because the nose has a conscious purpose to think mentally that now I'm going to smell things, but rather that it's simply in the nature of the nose to capture things around us by means of smelling things. Similar with the ear, which captures sound, that it's its function. So that is what teleology is about. Now, when it comes to human nature, it would thus, the concept of teleology or principle of teleology would just be applied to human nature, that there is a purpose of human beings as well. And therefore, morality, it's reasonable to say that morality is about human beings using their free will to accomplish that purpose, that end that is based on their human nature. So just to briefly say it again, teleology would be about purposes or ends within things objectively, and not ideas in our head that we impose on reality, but rather we recognize that things have purposes. So that was a sort of brief presentation of teleology and how that fits into the Aristotelian view of ethics, to put it that way.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that was a very good, brief presentation. So I was thinking as you were talking, if there is some example from physics that we could find. So, for example, water has the purpose or the end goal of I don't know, floating downhill or running downhill into the lowest place, or some kind of example like that. Or for example, matter has the purpose or the goal of moving towards other matter, or because the example with the heart and the nose is already very much focused on, again, on human beings and their perception of life or of material reality. So, but I think I learned this in a lecture, and it was very interesting that in modern science, nature is typically explained by laws. So we have the law of gravity, or the law, Maxwell's laws of electromagnetic. There are four laws by Maxwell about the behavior of electromagnetic things, or there are thermodynamic laws, or so modern scientists say, okay, the universe behaves according to certain laws. Now, in ancient times, this was not the way it was perceived, but the way it was perceived was that things strive towards something. So this is very similar, if not identical, to this idea of teleology, that everything strives towards something and perhaps also strives away from something. So, for example, why does the rock fall down? Because it wants to rejoin the other material which is of the same kind as itself. And why does the fire go upward? Well, because it wants to rejoin the same material as itself, which would be the sun. And so there, I think these ideas were, or observations about also material reality, were expressed in ways of striving, and not in ways of natural laws like gravity. But perhaps we could kind of translate it and say, yes, well, matter kind of has this this goal or this purpose of just falling down. And since in the universe there is no up and down, it just kind of tries to fall towards each other. I'm not sure. What do you think of that?
Right, yes. So when it comes to physics, as you pointed out, the concept of laws is often used to, you could say, describe things and explain things in the realm of physics. And yes, that those laws, you can certainly talk about them as a way of explaining and describing. And according to the more Aristotelian form of understanding of this, laws of physics would be understood as a shorthand of describing how things operate according to their nature, at least in certain circumstances. So take the law of gravity. You could sort of, as you pointed out, you can perhaps translate the law of gravity and describing it as a way that matter inherently, essentially moves or operates according to it being matter, that it has a way of being matter, and by its nature, it is directed toward attracting other matter, you might say. So perhaps you could thus say that gravity, the phenomenon of gravity, is really matter striving toward an end, which is, you might say, to attract other matter. And that would therefore be a compatibility between teleology and modern idea of laws in physics. So yes, those would be compatible to, in that sense at least. So yes, I would say they would be compatible. Yeah.
Great, great. Because then we would have found some application of teleology that, though it is formulated differently, actually most people today would agree, because most people agree that the law of gravity actually describes what we observe in the world correctly, or at least to a certain degree and within certain limitations. But so we could say that everything, like material objects, has a nature, and this nature leads to certain to a certain end, or to a certain you said final condition, or function, or purpose, or like this thing in a sense strives towards something. Now, of course, to strive is a word that comes from the human context. It's not like, as you said, the stone consciously thinks, oh, I really want to reach this ground because then I will be closer to all of my friend stones. But still, it operates in reality kind of following this principle, and the principle is kind of an abstraction from it. So in these simple examples, we can see that teleology is not just an anthropocentric concept, but it's actually just a description of the behavior of matter in the world. Now, it becomes a bit more tricky when we say, for example, the purpose of a car is to transport things, or the purpose of a tree is to produce good fruit, or statements like that. The purpose of a knife is to cut, so a good knife cuts well, is the example that we have used many times, because these things could then be said, well, isn't cutting and good fruit and transporting just human concepts? Because the matter out of which the car is made doesn't really care where some object is going or not going. So, yeah.
Right. So first, I would say that as you talked about Aristotle not talking about things mentally and consciously desiring certain ends, I'd also like to point out that, let's say you're reading St. Thomas Aquinas, he would use the word desire in a teleological sense. For instance, you would see in one of his work that he says that all things desire their own perfection. Now, some people reading that might misunderstand and think, oh, does it mean that all things have consciousness and desire things in that way? But no, it's not meant in that sense. It's meant desire in a completely non-conscious sense, in a more general sense of things just operating a certain way according to the nature, and that operation is directed towards an end goal. And that is what is meant by desires, not necessarily conscious desire, but just generally striving towards an end. So that's important to keep in mind when you read Aristotle or St. Thomas Aquinas.
Could I say something really brief to that? Because that was a really good remark from this professor from whom I learned what I've been talking about just now. He said, yeah, well, some people will laugh about ancient science and say, yeah, well, a stone can't desire something, or a stone can't drive towards something. But then ancient people could just as well laugh about modern science and say, well, a stone also doesn't follow a law. Following a law is also a human concept. So we are kind of stuck that we are using our own experience to try to explain the world in which we live. So I think that's just a nice little thing to keep in mind there.
That was brilliant, a brilliant point. Great. Yes, indeed. So when we use those terms are meant to signify reality. And sometimes in certain societies, in certain times, those terms might be regularly used in a more restrictive sense than other societies at other times would use, like the word desire. So yes, it would be understood then, according to teleology, that things can be inherently operating toward a certain end goal. And I would also mention that, well, this is also true of all cases of causality. Whenever you see a cause causing an effect, that means that it is within the purpose of that cause to cause that effect, because I'm using the word cause many times now, because that thing is directed toward generating this effect. Otherwise, it couldn't do that. So that's why also you could see in St. Thomas and probably other Aristotelian philosophers that causality involves both efficient cause and final cause. So efficient cause, that refers to things bringing other things to be or change in a certain way or bring into existence. But also final causality, that is teleology, is also involved, because the cause must have the effect as its end in order to be operating toward causing that. So that's also an interesting point. Now, when you talked about teleology with regards to, say, the car in your example, it would be said that, yes, the car doesn't have any conscious or mental desire, and it's a human artifact. It's created by human beings. But the car is inherently in its operation or mechanism. It has as its goal to drive, because that's what you see whenever you study and examine a car, that the whole operation, the whole system within the car is entirely directed toward making driving possible. So that would be an example of teleology within the context of human artifacts. So within artifacts, you see teleology directly imposed, in a sense that human beings create those things with those functions. But it's still true that those things objectively has that as its function. If all human beings suddenly disappeared from Earth, cars would still have the function of driving. And that will also be true of all natural things with regards to teleology in general, that other animals would have teleological purposes of perhaps feeding themselves in order to not be hungry. And another example of teleology would be trees growing. When trees start out as seeds, and then they grow and grow and eventually become trees, that's teleology. That's them moving toward the end of becoming a tree. So that's another great example of teleology.
Yes, good things that you pointed out there. So I think as you were talking about the cars, I was thinking perhaps we use today just a different word for the same meaning, and so we have perhaps difficulties understanding this ancient way of saying it, because today, of course, we would also say, well, the purpose of a car is to drive or to drive things around. Or perhaps we would say, well, this mechanism functions in such and such a way. And we would say that the mechanism functions properly if it does what it was designed for, and that it doesn't function properly if it doesn't do what it was designed for. And so we wouldn't say that the car has like a kind of like in its nature an inbuilt purpose or an inbuilt thing, because I don't know, because we perhaps say that a car is not a product of nature, but it's a product of man. But still we talk about the purpose of something and the function of something. So I think we can actually also understand these things. And it is true what you said, that the car could still be used in the manner in which it was intended and in the manner in which it functioned, even if no human beings were alive anymore. The car wouldn't magically lose its properties thereby. And so the properties are somehow, yes, and also something which cannot drive, we wouldn't call a car. And so you can really say that it is in the nature of a car that it can drive. So that's a crucial aspect of the nature, or of the definition, perhaps we would say today, of what makes something a car as opposed to not. So yes, I think so far, would you want to say something to that? Because I think I would agree on this level.
Right, I could just briefly comment that yes, philosophers like Dr. Edward Facer, a contemporary philosopher and follower of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, he would say that there are certain differences between human artifacts and substances that we find in nature, like stones and trees and rats, etc. That these natural things or substances they have a more inherent way of being and inherent principles of acting according to the nature and having a purpose, while artifacts are more artificial when it comes to teleology. You could say that yes, it's perhaps hard to explain for me right now, but at least there are some differences. So artifacts, when it comes to teleology, and nature with artifacts, there are some qualifications to be made. That's at least how I understand it. So that's something to keep in mind with you.
Yes. No, I think that's a good point, because you could, of course, say something which emerged or was created or came about through natural forces, kind of by itself, or at least not by itself, but without humans creating it, then it also has a nature or certain characteristics and certain normal forms of behavior, which would be defined independently of what humans do. So, as you say, a stone has certain properties, or certain, yes, you could say a nature and certain things towards which it drives, like falling down and coming close to other stones, which is independent of human beings. Whereas a car doesn't really, well, a car, yeah, it doesn't really in its nature have this purpose which is independent of human beings, because it was created by human beings.
Yeah, I would say that I was perhaps thinking more that cars and not artifacts, when it comes to machines, that the thing about machines is that they are more artificially composite things, that you have all these parts which they sort of in a more artificial way put together to form a certain things. But you can reorganize certain parts and you can put out certain parts without perhaps the whole nature sort of falling apart. It's difficult for me to properly explain it, but there is a difference, it seems, between machines, say, and things which are more naturally and substantially one kind of thing, like a tree or a rabbit or things like that. Substances. You could say that artifacts are made of substances, that the metal itself, the material metal, is something more unique or natural or substantial. But the artifact is more a composition of substances, according to Edward Facer, he would put it that way. So again, it's I'm not sure if I fully understood the distinctions, but at least we see some interesting qualifications or differences in that regard.
Yes, no, I think that's a good way that you put it, that machines or artifacts are kind of made by humans out of different naturally occurring substances, and then so yeah, there is certainly a distinction. Now I would like to go a little bit into this notion though of purpose, and especially of goodness, because as far as I understand Aristotle, there is also this idea that everything can be either good or bad, and it is good if it manages to achieve its nature, or to fulfill its nature in reality, to actualize its potential. So, for example, a tree has the potential that he can, from a small seed, grow into a full-grown tree, but a good tree will actually make this in reality. So he will actualize his potential, so that in the end there is now in reality a tree. And then there are more criteria. So for example, a good tree will grow straight, and a bad tree will grow crooked and small, and a good tree will grow large, or things like that. And now here comes my question in this specifically in this distinction between good and bad. I can see that some aspects can be defined perhaps independent of humans, but at least many critics, and to a part also myself, feel that many of these things are simply human preferences. So for example, why is a crooked tree worse than a straight tree, other than human beings wanting good lumber to produce houses, for example? Or why is a tree that makes delicious fruits better than a tree that makes fruits that don't taste so well?
Right, yes. That to that question, it would be said that goodness or badness is not based on human preferences, but rather the standard would be the essence or nature of a thing. And Edward Facer, he uses a simple example of that. Let's say that you have two people drawing a triangle on a piece of paper. One person is drawing the triangle very well, very perfect lines. It's very well drawn geometrically, a triangle. While the other person, let's say you have a five-year-old child, is drawing a very bad triangle with very bad lines, and it's very badly drawn. Now, the first triangle would be objectively a well-drawn triangle, and the other one would be a bad drawn triangle, not because of human preference, but according to whether it fulfills what it is, namely a triangle. Because we know that the perfect triangle, if we go by the essence or nature of a triangle, is to be a completely perfect triangular geometrical feature or thing. And we can try to imitate that perfection as good as we can when we draw triangles. So we can measure the goodness or badness of triangle according to how well they strive toward that perfection. So there one would say that, okay, we have a good triangle and we have a bad triangle, because they're good or bad according to whether they are their triangularity, according to whether they are triangles. So it would be based on that instead of human preferences. So even if you had a person coming in and he had this very strange idea that he likes badly drawn triangle, he thinks they're very cool or whatever, and he would say, no, that one drawn by that 5-year-old is far, far better than that other one. Okay, according to his preference, that would be better than the other. But according to them being triangles, so we have an objective standard, one is better than the other. And the same would be said therefore of, say, trees. Let's have two apple trees. The one apple tree bears apple trees that have good roots, and the other one has very bad roots and doesn't produce any apple trees. The apple trees would does produce good fruit and does produce apples and have good roots is objectively a better apple tree, because the standard we're using is what those things are essentially, which is apple tree. So that would be my explanation of the Aristotelian answer, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes. I think that's a very good explanation. Thank you for it. So, for example, if the 5-year-old would draw a triangle, but the lines are not straight, but they are kind of wobbly a little bit, and the corners are not pointy, but they are kind of rounded or kind of crooked, pointing to the side, then these would be all features which are actually not according to what we understand to be a triangle. And therefore, you can still recognize that it should be a triangle because of the rough shape, but there are more small deviations from the definition of a triangle than in the other case, and that's why it's a worse triangle. And you could say, well, it's a more beautiful piece of art, which I would want to hang on my wall, but then the standard would be something different, namely being a piece of art and not being a triangle.
Right, or let's say you are the father of that child, and that child draws that triangle and give it as a gift to you. You would like that very much, but that's because it's your child and you like to have gifts from your child. It's not based on the standard of them being triangles, good or bad in themselves. So that's another example.
Yes, and so, for example, I was thinking before, there are certain trees which are in some gardens used because they look pretty. It's a special form of hazelnut, and it grows very curly. All the branches grow kind of twisted like that. I don't know what it's called in English, but it exists, and it's and so there you would say a good, I think it's something like decorative hazel. So a good decorative hazel grows in this twisted manner because it looks kind of interesting. So if it would grow straight, then it wouldn't be a good decorative hazel because it's a different thing. But if you have a tree which by its nature grows straight, and then one instance of this tree, one individual grows really crooked, then you would say, well, that's a bad instance of this species of tree, because in general it is supposed to grow straight. Just like you would say, for example, some people have this deformity that they have a foot which is kind of, I don't know what's how it is called in English, but it's not well formed. It's kind of, I think the bones are kind of grown together or in a bad shape, and so it's called like a lump. But I think today you're no longer allowed to say this, but whatever. So this would not be a proper foot because we have this concept or this standard of how a healthy human foot actually is and how it works and how the different bones and sinews and all that stuff interact with each other. And then if something is not like this, then it is not a good foot, but it's not good or bad according to human preference, but it's just good or bad according to fulfilling the definition of this concept of which we are talking about.
Yes, exactly. And that is, for instance, what the doctors are at least attempting to do all the time, that they are figuring out, okay, we know what a healthy human being is, and let's look at the deviations from a healthy human being and deal with that. So they always have this standard of health, which is based upon the standard of a human being properly organized, you could say, in his body. And I would also say that science, the purpose of science is to figure out the essence or nature of things. That seems to be the Aristotelian view of the end of science, to find the nature, discover the nature of things. So when people ask, well, okay, well, then what is the essence of that thing? How do we determine then what the essence of a thing, so we can determine goodness or badness. Well, you could say that's the object of science or end of science to figure that out. So that's also an interesting point to talk about in that regard. But yeah, so goodness and badness in a very general sense would be based on essence. It is a thing more fulfilling its essence, then it's better. It's a thing worse in that regard, then it is objectively worse. And as we talked about earlier, moral goodness or morality, when goodness becomes of a moral thing, that involves free will, and that's why we see this in the case of human beings. But goodness or badness in this general philosophical sense, that is true of all things that have essences, that they are good or bad depending on whether they fulfill their essence.
Yes, yes, and perhaps for modern people who are not used to the word essence, you could perhaps replace it or circumscribe it with the word definition. So we have a certain concept. This concept has a definition, and as we have said, every concept needs a definition because that's how you can distinguish it from everything else. So what is, for example, yeah, we talked about this once, I think not on camera, but the difference between a stone and a handful of sand. Well, you could say, well, they are made of the same chemical substance. Yes, that's true, but still, if you order a truckload of sand because you want to make a sand pit for your child, and someone just throws a giant rock in your garden, and they will say, well, it's chemically the same thing, you will not be happy because still the essence of it is not the same because it's not fulfilling the definition. Yes, maybe so far.
Yes, those are very good points. So that would be the true way, I would say, of understanding how goodness and badness are understood. We see it at what it is according to its essence, and whether it fulfills the essence. That is the case, yes. And as you pointed out with a stone and sand, their essence would be the same, but they have different sizes and quantity. And when it comes to human beings organizing a certain number or amount of sand, okay, what they create out of that sand might be good or bad according to their own preferences or wishes or what they want or need. But if we look at objective reality, whether the sand itself is good, that becomes a question of essence.
Yes, yes, and you could say, just to make the example a bit more, use these words in relation to things that people use today normally. If you order sand and someone brings you gravel, for example, then you would say, no, this is not sand, or at least it's not good sand because it's perhaps too coarse. Or also if it's too fine, then it's also not good sand. Then it would just be dust or something like that. So, and then this is this idea that sand can be good or bad, but not in a moral sense and not in a conscious sense, but just in the sense that it is as the definition of sand says, then it's good sand.
Right. And you can use examples also with, let's say, alcohol. Alcohol in itself is a good thing, again, according to its essence. Could be better or bad according to whether it is the liquid it's supposed to be, but it could be bad for human beings to drink too much of it. So we can talk about goodness or badness in relation to human health and human need and human nature, but on a deeper level, we can talk about goodness or badness according to essence and what the thing is. A good that kind of thing and a good that kind of thing. Then we see essence being the foundation.
Yes, yes, very, very nice. I think that's also very helpful. And so basically where we started was this critique against teleology, that it's just anthropocentric, that we are calling, for example, a tree good just because human beings can eat from it, or we are calling a knife good just because it does something that human beings desire? And the answer to that would actually be no. There are different this concept of teleology and of something being good or bad can be applied in different scenarios. And so on the most basic level, it would just be what we call science today. How do things behave, and does something fit into this category or not? So it's just basically classification and description of behavior in other words, because it comes from a long time ago. And then also, as you pointed out, the distinction between moral goodness and goodness in this very abstract sense is, as we have touched upon in our previous conversation, that moral goodness has to do with human beings choosing between different options that are open to them and choosing the one which is good for their life or for their development of actualizing what we have called human nature. So to make this potential that you could be a good human being into actually being a good human being.
Right, exactly. So we would therefore say that it is moral for human beings to become good human beings. And a good human being is, as we have discussed, to be good according to the essence. So a good human being is a human being who accomplishes his natural purpose, his teleological end, which is grounded in his nature. So that is what morality is about from this Aristotelian perspective, and it makes sense and is true. And also you have this famous critique by David Hume, which separates the idea of something being a certain way and something which ought to be a certain way, the is-ought dilemma, which perhaps some in the audience are also familiar with. He seems to argue against teleology that just because the world is a certain way doesn't mean that it ought to be a certain way, that there is this separation between something being a certain way descriptively and something something should be a certain way, that some descriptive truths and normative truths are separate. You cannot derive ought from is. You cannot derive normative truth about what things should be from how things are. That's a famous critique from him. But that is false, I would say, because we can see that it's reasonable to talk about oughts in the context of essence and purpose. So we could say that a horse ought to have 4 legs because that would be natural to that horse being a horse. And we can also say that oughts have a moral significance when it comes to human beings, that we human beings ought to become good human beings because that is within our nature. That is what we are supposed to be, literally supposed to be that. So that's also a response I would give to that famous critique.
Wow, that's an interesting thing to get into. Perhaps I would just like to finish off one thing, and then we could get into this is-ought dichotomy, because I think that would be very interesting. So you have said that yes, moral goodness has to do with a human being becoming good, like existing in a way that is in accordance with its nature. And the nature could be, again, derived from what we have talked about in our previous conversation. So one central aspect is that a human being, for example, is rational. And so living in according with reason would be good, and not doing so would be bad. And also a human being is a social animal, but not in the same way as other animals, but in a specific sociality as human beings live them. And so, for example, having that incorporated in one's life also would be a part of being a good human being, whereas perhaps, now this is a difficult statement, but living very isolated from everyone and not having any contact with anyone at all would then not be in accordance with this nature. So one question that just came up in my mind is, isn't there like a circular reasoning somewhere? I would find it hard to express, but I was just, yeah, I think I can't express it very well, but would you want to say something to that?
No, yes, I would say something, and I would say that I don't see a circularity. I would see it as a sort of hierarchy of truths that we derive from other truths. So we have, for instance, principles that human beings ought not to do harm to others in a society. Human beings ought not to lie. Human beings ought not to harm their bodies. And that is derived from the truth that human beings ought to become good human beings, that they should use their free will to become good. And that is again based on essence and teleology. And essence and teleology are in things, and we discover them by examining and looking at things around us in the world. So I would say that we have this hierarchy of truths based on this metaphysical foundation.
Yes, I think that's a good way of, it makes sense to me that you would say, no, it's not circular, but it's kind of hierarchical. So there is, the starting point is the human nature, and then from there, certain things follow. And even the definition of morality itself follows from there. And so it's not circular, but it's kind of hierarchical. Yes, I had just one more brief question about this teleology, because it seems to me we have now defined two ways in which something can be good. It can be good just kind of according to its own essence or its own definition, like a good triangle or a good tree or a good apple or whatever. It can be good in a moral sense, like it is good to do this or that because it helps you actualize your potential and become a good human being according to what a human being is. So that would be the moral goodness. And then there is also this third kind of goodness, at least I think so, which is like a good knife or a good chair or a good apple, but good in the sense that it does this thing which I, as the acting subject, want it to do or want it to be. So for example, yes, a good knife cuts well. Why? Because I, as the acting subject, want to cut something. And so if the knife doesn't cut, then it's bad. So, or for example, if an apple has a worm in it, then it would be, or is a little bit soft in some place, then it would be a bad apple. Why? Because it won't taste well to me. But the apple might still be capable of producing seeds that will grow into another tree. So it's not bad according perhaps to its definition, or at least, yeah, what do you think? Is this third category, does it exist, or do I mix something up here?
Do I understand your idea of this category being something being good according to human preference?
Perhaps that's what I'm trying to get at. Yes, perhaps you summarized it well.
Right, yes. Then you could say that it is at least perceived goodness, that it's perceived to be good. But whether it is objectively good, I wouldn't perhaps call that, because you could prefer something to be good which is actually harmful for
yes.
you. So yeah.
Yes, that's very nice. That's great. That's very to the point, because it goes to this thing that we have mentioned a couple of times, that feeling good and doing something which actually is good in reality is not the same thing, because the perception of something being good is perhaps, as you said, it can or cannot be then objectively good, because you could, for example, experience this huge chocolate cake that you are eating as good, but it's actually bad for your health. And so it's not good for you in the objective sense that you should try to become, or that you for being a good human being, because it would be bad for your health.
Right, exactly. That's very true. And also, I'm not sure if you remember, but I once stated that you could say that all human action is motivated by perceived goodness. And that is, again, something that is perceived to be good in a very broad and general sense. When someone is very angry and does violence to another human being, which is immoral and not good objectively, he might perceive it as good. So that's another example of that general principle. Yeah.
Yes, that's very good there. This distinction between perceiving something as good and it objectively being good according to some definition of some concept, or to some according to its essence. So yes, that's great.